So last week I talked about getting into what the handwriting on the wall said in Belshazzar's palace, but I think I'm going to put that off till next week. Well, I think I am going to put it off till next week because there were some things I saw in the story of Belshazzar, the Babylonian king, that I wanted to talk about in a little more detail. We kind of touched on them last week, but I wanted to do just a little bit more because if nothing else, it speaks to me. So Daniel chapter 5, we'll begin by reading verses 30 and 31. That very night, Belshazzar the Chaldean, or another word for Babylonian, the Chaldean king was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. I've been thinking about this story, and I think I may have said this last week, I can't remember. But in some ways, I think Belshazzar, if you want to look for a parallel figure to him in the New Testament, the rich fool in the parable that Jesus told in Luke 12 kind of reminds me of this Babylonian king. Let me read that story. Luke chapter 12, verses 16 through 21. He told them a parable, saying, "The land of a rich man produced plentifully, and he thought to himself, 'What shall I do? For I have nowhere to store my crops.' And he said, 'I will do this. I will tear down my barns and build larger ones, and there I will store all my grain and my goods. And I will say to my soul, Soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years.'" Let me pause there. You remember, that's what we've been saying about the city of Babylon. They're under siege at the time that Daniel 5 takes place, but Belshazzar has got food and supplies stored up to last for years, thick, heavy walls, and he's not worried about what's going on outside. So you have ample goods laid up for many years, so therefore what? Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. In other words, have a party. But God said to him, "Fool," that's why we call him the rich fool, "this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared, whose will they be? And so is the one who lays up treasure for himself and is not rich toward God." So kind of where I see the parallels here between the rich fool and Belshazzar. First of all, both of them refused to listen to reason, just on a human level. Belshazzar should have been out taking care of this army that's coming against him. He should have been paying attention there. The rich fool should have been using his wealth for something other than just, feeding his own appetite. He should have used it to help others, build relationships. So that's just the reasonableness of life. Neither one of them seemed to care about how to get along, how to solve problems, anything like that. But the worst thing, the second thing, and far worse, they both refused to listen to God. They are not interested in anything God or a godly person would have said to them because they were all about themselves. And so this question in Luke 12, verse 20, that God asks the rich fool, he could equally have asked it of King Belshazzar. Remember, he said, "But God said to him, 'Fool, this night your soul is required of you, and the things you have prepared,'" in other words, the things you've laid aside for yourself, "whose will they be?" You can't take it with you. What are you doing? What are you thinking? God gives you all of this, and you're going to just make it all about you. And so people have studied this story of Belshazzar. And a lot of people have asked this question, at least I ran across it a lot in my study the past few weeks. And they said, Belshazzar wasn't the only foolish or proud Babylonian king. His grandfather, King Nebuchadnezzar, was just as proud, really arrogant to the extreme. And so why did God spare the grandfather's life, Nebuchadnezzar, right? But he chooses to end Belshazzar's life. And just to get us going here, there are at least a couple of reasons I can see why this would happen. Number one, even though they're both proud, Nebuchadnezzar repented of his pride. Now, it took a lot to get him to that point, but he did, right? And we'll talk about that as we get further. But Belshazzar didn't. He stayed as he was. He was shocked by what he saw, the writing on the wall, but there's no indication that he wanted to repent of his sin. So that's the first reason Nebuchadnezzar spared, Belshazzar isn't. And the second reason is I see it this way in terms of a timeline. during Nebuchadnezzar's time as king of Babylon, God had a purpose for Babylon in terms of how they related to Israel. And so God was using Babylon. They thought they were the ones in charge of Israel. They didn't realize God was in charge of them. But by the time Belshazzar's king, that purpose is gone. Israel has come to the end of their time of captivity just about. God's getting ready to send them back to their homeland. And so God's use for Babylon is over. And so that's the bigger picture. And it's accurate. But the reason I want to get into some more about Belshazzar tonight is because it's not a complete picture. There's more things about his character that I want us to look at, because when you see where he falls short, it can remind you of yourself, or at least it reminded me of myself. You don't have to be a Babylonian king to be proud, right? You don't have to be a Babylonian king to have problems with not being willing to listen to God. So even in our own lives, we can have these same issues. So the first thing I want to point out is that you notice how God was the one who allowed Belshazzar to be king of the most powerful nation on earth. Belshazzar thought he inherited it because his grandfather, but God's the one in charge, right? So he's not there because he's anything special. This is God who has allowed him to be here. And he's in a place of great responsibility. I mean, this is a powerful empire. But he doesn't take his responsibility seriously. He stays locked up in his city, capital city, and he's going to have this party. So in other words, he's using his authority and his power and what he has available just to inflate his own ego and have a good time. Let's go back to verse 1 of chapter 5. And this is how we're introduced to him. This is the first time we read about him in the Bible. King Belshazzar made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in front of the 1,000. So I want to read that last phrase again because it says something about him. He drank wine in front of the 1,000. That's an unusual choice of words. You know, you wouldn't say that, oh yeah, last night I went with my friends to Buffalo Wild Wings and I ate chicken wings in front of them. I could say that, but I wouldn't, right? That's not something you say. And especially talking about wine, there's 1,000 people. And in a sense, it's almost like a performance, right? He does this in front of them. Why? He's the king. All eyes were on him. He's probably not sitting down with the rest of them. He's probably at his own table, kind of elevated above, and everybody's looking at him. That's what he wanted. And he begins to drink wine, and he's getting drunk. You'll see it as the story unfolds. And I think he's doing it as a show of bravado, right? Everybody knows the enemies of Babylon are surrounding the city, and there's no way in and there's no way out. And he's drinking as this show of, hey, I'm not worried about it. I don't care. This isn't a problem. Well, now I'm speculating here, and I could be wrong. And you guys can argue with me afterward if you want. That's fine. But I think he did care. Anybody would care if you've got an enemy army surrounding your city, right? And they're blocking access. And if you go out, you're going to get killed. I think he did care, but he didn't want to admit it. He didn't want anybody to see that he's worried. And so what this really is, in my opinion, this is a false display of manliness or tough guyism or rugged He-Man, I'm not worried. And we still see that today. That's not a Babylonian problem. This has always been an issue, right? People acting tougher than they really are, right? A lot of us feel, and not even just tough guys, right? A lot of us feel this need to project an image as if nothing bothers us. And so someone asks you how you're doing and you lie to them, right? Oh, everything's fine. When in many cases it's not fine. Now, if someone's just exchanging a little pleasantry, I get why you say that. But somebody that actually cares will ask you sometimes, and yeah, I'm fine. When you're not fine. And I think that's what Belshazzar's doing here. And I think it's something he tried to do on a regular basis, only he takes it to a new level of a different level. He's like, yeah, I'm fine. I'm drinking wine. I'm having a good time. Yeah, I know there's an army around me, but I'm not worried about it. And so he's drinking and he's getting drunk. And the more he gets drunk, the more foolish his choices become. So let's go to verse 2. Belshazzar, when he tasted the wine, commanded that the vessels of gold and of silver that Nebuchadnezzar his father had taken out of the temple in Jerusalem be brought, that the king and his lords, his wives and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought in the golden vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God in Jerusalem, and the king and his lords and his wives and his concubines drank from them. And then, verse 4, they drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze, iron, wood, and stone. So they're using the vessels from the temple in Jerusalem, but they're praising these pagan gods of Babylon. And the question is, and again, this is me kind of speculating a little bit. And again, if you don't agree, I'd be interested in hearing your take on it afterward, or if you have something to add. Why would he do this? Why would he specifically choose those vessels? Because Babylon had conquered more than Judah. Judah was just one of the more recent ones, but they had dozens of nations that they had conquered. And no doubt, when they had conquered those nations, they had gone into their temples, and taken sacred vessels from all of these nations. So why does he specifically take the vessels from the Jewish temple and then use them in a way that's very, very disrespectful? He's not just drinking from them. He's toasting false gods, the gods of or his nation, using the vessels of the God of the Jews. Now, and this is me speculating. Other people have said this, but I can't prove this. But here's what I think. The Jews and their sacred vessels represented the presence and power of God. Now, I'm not saying those cups were magic. I'm not saying that. But they were symbols. They represented the presence of God. They represented the power of God. And I believe, and I'm sure I'm right about this, Belshazzar was under the control of Satan, right? He's not in any way a godly man. And so these symbols of God's power and presence were a natural target for him. Anybody who's under the control of Satan is going to target God's people. And in this time of history, the Jews are God's people. Christians don't exist at that point. The Jews represent the people of God. Even at the height of Nebuchadnezzar's arrogance, when, the grandfather, he would never have done something like this. He was proud, we know that, he was arrogant, but he had some restraint, some self-restraint about disrespecting Israel's God. But here's Belshazzar, 2 generations removed from Nebuchadnezzar, and he's taking it to a whole new level. Now, if he had just said, well, bring me the vessels from any temple, then maybe you could say, well, he did it out of ignorance, didn't know what he was doing. But he very specifically demands the vessels from the temple in Jerusalem. So he knew exactly what those vessels were. He knew exactly where they had come from. And again, I believe it's because he was under Satan's control. And he's getting drunk, and he's trying to prove that he's, a big tough guy, not worried about anything. And so he makes this really, really foolish decision, which Paul kind of mirrors the foolish things people do. Galatians 6, verse 7. Do not be deceived, God is not mocked. That's what Belshazzar is doing. He's trying to mock God. Under the control of the enemy, he's trying to mock God, but God is not mocked. Why? For whatever one sows, that will he also reap. That's where his arrogance has taken him. I can stand face to face with the God of Israel, and I can treat the vessels from his temple with contempt and disrespect, and no one can do anything about it. That's what he's thinking. Now again, Nebuchadnezzar, his grandfather, was also arrogant, incredibly arrogant. We know that because the Bible says so. You remember the story back in chapter 4, verse 29. At the end of 12 months, this is Nebuchadnezzar, was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, and the king answered and said, is this not great Babylon, which I have built by my mighty power as a royal residence, and for the glory of my majesty? But then you remembered, we spent a lot of time on this. God intervenes and humbles Nebuchadnezzar in a really dramatic way, and he's living like an animal out in the fields, and finally God releases him from that time of judgment, and this once proud, once arrogant king had learned his lesson, finally, and he began to give God the glory. That's in verse 34. At the end of the days, the days he'd been living like an animal, I, Nebuchadnezzar, lifted my eyes to heaven, and my reason returned to me, and I blessed the Most High, and praised and honored him who lives forever, for his dominion is an everlasting dominion, and his kingdom endures from generation to generation. So, here's what I think is going on here in terms of why Nebuchadnezzar is allowed to live. God could have allowed Belshazzar to live, but he doesn't. This is my opinion. This is not gospel, okay? But in my opinion, God knew that Belshazzar would never repent like Nebuchadnezzar had. That's my view. Nebuchadnezzar made things right with God. Belshazzar, he's so full of himself, and he's so under the power of the enemy that there's no way. And there are people that are like that. You know people that are like that in your own life. They may not be the king of Babylon, but they have that same spirit of pride that no matter what, they refuse to submit to anything or anyone. No one's going to tell me what to do. Well, good luck with that, right? But this guy Belshazzar, he was so fixated on himself, it had caused him to become blind to anything else. It's almost like he's living in this world of make-believe, where because he's the king of Babylon, he can do whatever he wants and everything has to go his way. He's going to throw his party, he's going to drink his wine, get drunk, disrespect the God of Israel, and no one can do anything about it because I'm the king of Babylon. And so he makes these foolish decisions. So some people have said, well, it's just because he was drunk. But I think it was more than that. I think he had already, before this night, lost touch with reality, because that's how obsessed he was with himself. And again, we know people like that. They live and I may be using this phrase wrong, but I'm going to use it again, a dream world, a fantasy land, where they're so consumed with themselves, they're unable to listen to either reason or God. They just don't hear. They're blind, they're deaf, they don't want to hear anything. And so that's why I said a few moments ago that this King Belshazzar reminds me of the rich fool that Jesus told about in his parable. One more time, let me read Luke 12:19. I will say to my soul, soul, you have ample goods laid up for many years. Relax, eat, drink, and be merry. Look, I've got it all. I don't answer to anyone. I can take care of myself. But just like that rich fool, Belshazzar didn't see that his soul would also be required of him that night. Let me wrap it up with a little bit of just a few thoughts about the dangers of pride. One of the most famous verses about pride, you know I'd have to go there, is in Proverbs 16, verse 18. We all know it. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. Now, there's actually quite a bit of debate. And this is an entire sermon. I'm not going to get into all of that. But there's quite a bit of debate in the church world about what pride is. Like people say, well, you know, my child did well in math. Can I not be proud of them? Yeah. That's not what this is talking about. You can be proud of your kids. You know, you can be. It's not all pride that's wrong. The biblical definition of pride that's sinful is essentially an attitude that says, I don't need God's help to make it. That's the definition of pride that will send you to hell. So it's not wrong to say to your 8-year-old, hey man, you did a great job, I'm proud of you. Fantastic, right? But when you cross that line into saying, I don't need God. I can make it on my own by relying on myself, my resources, my strength, my intelligence, whatever. That's when you go into an area of pride that brings destruction. And so that's what a fool does, right? They may be intelligent, but they're still foolish if you think you can make it without God. Whereas those who are wise admit that they can't do it on their own. They admit they need God. And so you see the difference here. A fool is blind to his weakness. He genuinely thinks he can do it on his own. I don't need God. But a wise person realizes the truth. Without God, I can't do anything. And essentially, this is an extreme statement, but I'll stand by this. Without God, my life is a waste. I may win the whole world, gain the whole world. But if I don't have God in my life, what do I have? Nothing. So every time we make a choice, either I'm going to depend on myself or I'm going to depend on God, what I'm actually doing is sowing seed into my destiny. And Proverbs 29:23 talks about it. One's pride, a person's pride will bring him low. In other words, it won't go well for you. But he who is lowly in spirit, meaning humble and submitted to God, will obtain honor. And so in my perspective now, I'm going to wrap it up with this, then we'll have our discussion. That's in some ways the biggest difference between Nebuchadnezzar and Belshazzar. Nebuchadnezzar, in some ways, was just as proud as Belshazzar, but he accepted God's discipline, and as a result, his life was restored and his honor, right? Belshazzar was also proud, extremely proud, but I think the indication of Scripture here is that he wouldn't have accepted God's discipline. He certainly was very dismissive of Daniel, great man of God, and we talked about that last week, and ultimately it cost him his life. We all struggle with pride to a degree. Everybody does, right? But where it crosses the line and becomes extremely dangerous is when you refuse God's discipline, when you refuse godly counsel, and you just stick to your idea that no one can tell me anything. And I've been there, and I know how dangerous it is. And because of that, again, that night Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed, and Darius the Mede received the kingdom being about 62 years old. Pride. And again, it's not being proud of your kid for doing well. It's not being this or that. It's when you say, I can do this without God, and no one, including God, can tell me anything.